Okay, so welcome to the Immigration and Multiculturalism panel. A very important topic for the freedom movement around the world and the world itself. Big topic, but today we have great lecturers with us, Professor Chandran Kukathas and Craig Biddle, and they have both covered this topic from several different angles. It's a huge topic, so we are not going to cover everything, but we are going to focus on most fundamental things. And those, I think, are, and I would like to start with, why do we believe what we believe, and I would like us to really reinforce as a movement our arguments for more open borders. And after that, I think that it's crucial to really learn and understand, to listen to those who are skeptical of our arguments, to those who are against open borders, to those who are against more migration and who want to close the borders or who are opposed to it for any reason. And we need to be able, as a movement, to respond to them in a way that will convince them and probably change their mind, hopefully. And the third thing, because I'm guessing that a lot of people here would at some point like to do policy, and that we as a movement really need to be able to turn the ideas into public policy solutions if we want to become actionable, mainstream, and if we want to be proactive. I'm not going to do any more introduction. We are going to go straight to discussion very quickly. I just have to remind you that there will be a Q&A in the end, so if you have a question, you have to post it on Twitter, and you tag my handle, which you will be able to see, I think, on the screen. Oh, it's on the screen now, and it will probably be throughout this panel. Also, last but not least, if you are enjoying this conference, if you are enjoying this panel, make sure that the world hears it. So post quotes, pictures, videos, your impressions on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, whatever you're using, and just post relentlessly, because we need more people to hear the messages from this event beyond these walls. Okay, and with that, I would like to start. And the first big question for our panelists here today is why? Why do we believe in open borders at all, or more migration? Why is it a good thing? And I would like to start with a question to Craig. Craig, if you meet a person that's not a libertarian, and that's not maybe deeply educated in philosophy, and they ask you, why are you so passionate about more open borders, a freer migration system, what would you tell them?
The first thing I would want to clarify, if the question came in the form of the phrase open borders, is that I like to draw a distinction between open immigration and open borders. And I think it's an important distinction. I think that the borders of states and countries are important. They demarcate the area within which the government in that state has jurisdiction, and where the individuals within that perimeter are going to be have presumably, or they should, have their rights protected by that government. So borders are not trivial, and they shouldn't be just done away with, because they serve a purpose. So I think it's important to speak not in terms of open borders, because that's just the idea of, it sounds like, and a lot of people who have argued for open borders, I think, have, in a sense, are trying to eliminate the idea of borders. So I would say I'm not for open borders, I'm for open immigration. And the difference is this. Open immigration respects the existence of borders, and it says, in effect, if you want to come into this country, you're welcome to come in. You must enter at a designated checkpoint, and unless we have some reason to believe that you are, up to no good, you're a terrorist, or you have some violent inclinations or aspirations, or you're carrying some kind of a deadly, contagion, you're welcome to come in, but you just can't come in anywhere you want, anytime you want, without any monitoring whatsoever. Now, I know there are a lot of people in the libertarian movement who disagree with this position and just prefer literally open borders. But that's why this distinction is important, because this is an argument that needs to be had, And so I think that the people who want literally open borders with no government checks of any kind for people entering and leaving, that should be designated open borders, that position. And then the position that I advocate, I like to designate as open immigration, which means anyone is welcome to come in. There's no limitations on who can come unless they pose a demonstrable threat to the rights of the people in that region. And demonstrable is the key word there. Because you can't just say, well, I feel, I don't like this guy, or I feel like his religion is a threat to me, or whatever. It has to be a demonstrable threat, and if that's there, then I think, looking into the person, and if you find out that there's really a threat, you say, no, you may not come in. So that's, I wanted to get that distinction on the table because I think it's important.
But why? What drives your passion for this?
Oh, what drives my passion about open immigration is the fact that human beings, every human being, so long as he's not violating the rights of others, has a right to liberty, which means to act on his judgment, which includes moving to wherever he or she wants to live. The state has absolutely no right to say to anyone that you cannot come into this country and live peacefully and productively among the other people here. This is, to me, this is all about rights. It's all about the moral right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we all have that right, and I think that we have the moral high ground on this over the people who want to curb or eliminate immigration. And I think we need to take that moral high ground, and we need to use moral language and the terminology of moral rights in this battle, because we do have that moral high ground, and it's not just that it's practical. It's obviously, I think it's obvious to most people in this room, that it's economically practical for people to be able to cross borders and trade and hire and work with each other. But it's also important because it's morally correct that they are free to do that. And then I think it's also worth bringing in a third thing, and that is that it's socially important, right? We want to live, it makes life better to live with people of all sorts of different tastes and varieties and different kinds of arts and different kinds of culture. So the cultural value of open immigration and people being able to cross borders freely is enormous. So I think those three things, let's hit the moral and keep the moral high ground, talk about the social importance and the enormous value of an integrated globe, and then obviously the economic, enormous economic value of being able to trade.
Professor Kukathas, when we speak about migration, the migration controls, and generally when we hear this debate, we usually see people focusing on the physical borders. So libertarians will say, open the borders, and then those who are opposed to migration will say, let's close the borders. Therefore, we have these political slogans like build the wall or patrol the seas or just seal the border. We need more control. And but from your talks, you emphasize often that this is not really so, and that the migration control actually doesn't begin and doesn't end at the border control on one side, but there is also probably a few other things that we are getting wrong when we discuss migration, how we see immigrants, how we see the host country, how we see the capacity of the government to deal with migration control. And it would be great, I think, for our audience to hear your perspective on this.
Yes, I think what I share with Craig is the thought that what we're concerned about is freedom or liberty. This is why we're interested in the question about immigration control. But I think you're quite right. One of the things I've tried to emphasize is that immigration control doesn't begin or stop at the border. Joseph Cairns wrote a very famous article on open borders where he began with the expression or the sentence, borders have guards and guards have guns. And he's quite right about the fact that immigration control is really a matter of using force. But I think what's been missed is the extent to which that force is exercised not just against immigrants or would-be immigrants, is actually exercised against the citizens and residents of a society, because immigration control is not really about just crossing the border. Most governments, most states like to see the borders crossed because they want tourists to come in, they want football teams to visit, they want all kinds of exchanges, they want the money that comes with people crossing the border. But what they want to do is control what people do once they've crossed the border. They want to control their entry into the labor market, they want to control whether they reside, and so on. But they can't do this without controlling their own citizens, because citizens generally are very inclined to engage with other people, to trade with them, to do business, to marry them, to do all kinds of things that the state deems unacceptable. So I think my focus on immigration control has always been on the point that the real threat to freedom and therefore to liberal democratic values, which is what people appeal to when they want to restrict immigration, the real threat comes not from immigration, but from immigration control. But there's another point I think that's equally important, maybe even more important, and that is that the whole discussion about immigration control presupposes something that's just not evident, and that is that there is a fixed entity called the nation or the state or the people in whose interests we exclude those who are outsiders. But historically, in fact, immigration control has been exercised in order to create and shape the nation itself. The nation is not an independently existing entity. So let me give you one fairly dramatic example of this. By the 1930s, about a quarter of the world held one nationality, and they were British, because the British Empire extended the right of membership of Britain to all members of its empire. Everyone had British nationality. This is why when Freddie Mercury moved to Britain from Zanzibar, he didn't need a visa. He barely needed a passport, because there was, in principle, free movement. Now, in reality, there wasn't, because there were lots of informal controls, as some people were concerned about the movement of people. And over the years, post-independence, many countries lost their citizens' right to be British. But what this tells you is nationality is not fixed. In fact, nationality shrank as a result of immigration control. Trying to turn people into immigrants shrank the number of people who were in fact British, which raises the obvious question: how do you tell what is someone's nationality or who is the people? Because all of these nations that we see in the world were created substantially through immigration control. Immigration control is not something that comes after you create the nation. You create the nation through immigration control. So the obvious question is, how are you doing it? How are you deciding who is in and who is out? And who decides? If you say it's the people, that begs the question. So someone is exercising power, but what they're exercising is power over people within the communities to exclude them. That's how immigration control begins.
So it's much more complex than politicians would like us to believe often, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, okay, and then, okay, so we understand now that we have established that it's moral, that it's usually practical to have more migration, and it's very hard and very complex to actually control it, and it can be actually counterproductive. But, and somebody maybe not from our circle says, okay, I agree with you on that, but still, security, like I'm afraid. What about terrorists? What about criminals? What about people with different habits, people who have contagious disease? How would you, Professor Kukathas, answer to those people?
Well, immigration control is really a very bad tool for dealing with, for example, terrorism. I mean, if you take, say, the United States, about 380 million people cross the border in both directions every year. Okay? Now, controlling immigration is not about controlling movement across borders. It's not about controlling entry. Controlling immigration is really about who do you give visas to? How long are the visas given for? What are the categories of people who are admitted? So none of these things are going to change the likelihood of terrorism. How is it that denying a student a visa or giving a student a visa for 6 months rather than a year going to be of any interest to those who are concerned about addressing the problem of terrorism? Of course, there are security concerns, but immigration control is just the wrong tool for using.
Craig, do you have an answer for this claim?
I agree with that. I think immigration control is the wrong tool for using it. Immigration is not today only a matter of crossing the border, but it should be only a matter of crossing the border. That should be it. If you do not pose a threat to the citizens of the country into which you want to travel, you should be permitted to cross the border. And then, once you're in there, you should be permitted to stay as long as you want and to work in whatever industry or fashion you choose to work in. So it's true that that's not the way that it is, but that's the way that it should be. I think that visas and all forms of tracking people once they're in a country or tracking their employment or how long they stay should simply be done away with. They serve no moral purpose. All they do is violate the rights of the people who wish to emigrate and the people who wish to hire and work with them. So as far as the dangers posed, those dangers are not posed by somebody once somebody is in a country and working. In what way is he posing a danger? Unless he's a criminal. If he's a criminal, well, we have police to take care of criminals. We have courts. We have systems to do that. If he's a terrorist, if he's, say, a jihadist or something, that's why you want to have set checkpoints for entry into a country. You want to have an objective screening process, which is the details of which we can discuss, but it would be essentially the intelligence agencies would use whatever tools they have to try to make sure that anyone they have some degree of knowledge on, that this person might be a threat, that they have checkpoints looking for those kinds of people coming through. If some granny comes through or some perfectly innocent person and there's no evidence to suggest that this person is a danger, he should either not be stopped at all. He should just have to come through a checkpoint rather than anywhere he wants, so that there's the opportunity to check him if there's evidence that warrants that. Once he's in the country, it should be done. That should be the end of it. He's now in the country. He's free to work and travel and integrate with the culture as he sees fit. So I agree it's not simple, but it should be simple. That's the thing. And if it were simple, if you had designated checkpoints with objective screening processes, the quote, border security, which wouldn't even really be a thing. It would be such a small, concentrated group of people that it just wouldn't be that big a deal. They would be able to focus their efforts on dealing with people coming through there, and then anyone who did try to enter the country at a non-designated checkpoint would, by that fact, be legitimately suspicious. So then the people who are responsible for ensuring that people don't come in those areas, whether you want to call them the border security or whether you want to just call them the police in the nation, they could focus their efforts on those people who are genuinely suspiciously active. Why wouldn't they, if they're up to, if they're up to good will, why would they not just come in at a designated checkpoint? There's no reason for them not to. So it enables the security agencies to focus where they need to focus to keep us safe.
Okay, understood. There is another question that I hear, and this is often coming from people who are generally pro-migration from our own circles, in our own movement. And the claim is the following, that because we have democracy in most Western societies, we have in many of them multiculturalist policies which grant certain special rights to certain communities, that immigration is not compatible, fundamentally it's incompatible with these systems, and that we can imagine a situation where people who hold different views, who maybe disagree with the way we do things in the West, for example, how we treat LGBT community or how we treat women or our views on punishment of criminals, they have just different views, and that if there is a critical mass of them, they can use democracy to fundamentally change our societies by changing our institutions, the laws, and the Constitution. Or if they don't do that, they could maybe, because of the multiculturalist policies, form ghettos where the laws of the rest of the society would not apply. And then they will point out, the people who advocate for this view would point out certain like ghetto-like communities around Europe maybe, and they will say, see, that's what's happening and we're going to have more of that. How would you respond to them?
Yeah, this is where, again, I think morality has to be brought into the picture, because we have to be clear that human beings have rights, and people who want to violate the rights of human beings, whether it's because they're gay or because they're women or because they're, because they share a different religion, they're morally wrong. Their position is morally wrong. So if, as a culture, we are willing to use that language and condemn rights violating and irrational ideas in general. I mean, so, I know that I'm not, there are a lot of people who will disagree with this position, but I think that accepting ideas on the basis of faith is wrong. It's just a wrong thing to do. Faith is not a means of knowledge, and it's dangerous to accept ideas on the basis of faith. If you accept ideas on the basis of faith, and if you have faith that you should behead me because I have a different religion than you, then you are, by that fact, convinced that you should do it. It's true, you have faith, right? This is a really dangerous idea that faith is a means of knowledge. It's not. Reason is our means of knowledge. And we should hold this as a moral truth. Now, if you want to embrace a religion because you like the stories and you get something out of the parables, fine. But do not treat faith as a means of knowledge, because this is the problem with jihad, by the way. The reason I'm bringing this up, jihadists believe that there's a God who wants them to convert or kill us. That's really dangerous, and the only reason they believe it is because they accept it on faith. There's no evidence for the existence of this God anywhere, and there's certainly no evidence for the existence of a God who has that particular wish, right? It's just ridiculous. So I think if we want to make our society safe, and if we want the people who come in to bring in the good parts of other cultures, the dance, the arts, the food, the different kinds of dress, the things that are really interesting about other cultures, for goodness sakes, yes, bring those in. Let's mix all the cultures together and enjoy that richness. But we have to draw the line at the things that are anti-life. Things like faith and beliefs that are contrary to the existence of peaceful human coexistence. So I'm not saying that if you are a person of faith, you shouldn't be permitted into a country. I'm saying that people in a country who want to maintain a peaceful culture should look down on the idea of accepting faith as a means of knowledge. Now, I know this is a very fundamental, not the most popular view in the world, but if you think about it, it's true. Faith isn't the means of knowledge, and it's a dangerous thing to hold it as that. So how do we keep people from turning into, from ghettoizing and destroying the good aspects of a culture? Take morality seriously, and call a spade and say, no. If you want to integrate with the good culture here and bring in new aspects of your culture into this, let's keep it all to the things that serve human life instead of the things that harm human life.
Professor, do you think that this threat is real, legitimate? And if so, how do you think we should address it?
I think the threat of things like ghettoization and the worry that people who come in from the outside and subvert liberal democratic institutions is really misplaced for a couple of different reasons, because they're different examples. When it comes to the subversion of democracy and existing institutions, I think there's just no evidence of this. There is plenty of theory that says it's possible. It's quite possible that if many people come in, that they will form a majority and try through the democratic process to change the institutions or even the constitutional structure. But where are there any examples of this actually taking place, even in societies with massive amounts of immigration? It also presupposes that anyone who comes in will automatically get the right to citizenship. And here I think it's worth noting that immigration does not mean joining a society or a state or a nation. It simply means moving to another place and interacting and relating to people. It doesn't presuppose acquiring any kind of political rights. And there are so many different systems out there in the world, many of which don't allow you any kind of political rights until you actually become a citizen, in which case you'd have to qualify for membership in some way through having passed certain tests and so on that demonstrate that you have the right attitudes towards the Constitution and so on. So I think on that side it's not really a serious worry. On the issue of ghettoization, people forming into collectivities and so on, a part of it, I think, as Craig says, if people are left free to their own devices and you recognize the principles of individual freedom, which most liberal democracies do, then you have to accept that people will live where they wish to live. Now, one thing you might, however, ask is, why is it, though, that people are forming ghettos, and address that problem as a problem in itself? Is it because they're excluded from other opportunities to live in other places? Is it because housing policies, which our previous panel spoke about, are leading to a situation in which poor people end up being clustered in certain areas or forced into certain areas? There are all kinds of reasons for these things happening. So once again, the idea that you're going to address problems like this through the instruments of immigration control are really very far-fetched. I think they have almost nothing to do with the way in which people happen to cluster or live together or practice what they do. There are all kinds of other factors at work. And if you do think this is a problem in social policy, then find the tools of social policy to address them, if there really is a serious issue that's going to arise of violence or anything like that. But immigration is just, again, it's the wrong hammer to crack a very small nut.
It's a very, very good point. What do you think about the welfare state, though? The welfare, are immigrants a stretch on the welfare state? That's one of the common arguments. We cannot have both. You cannot have the welfare state and you cannot have free immigration at the same time, because the welfare state is already stretched thin, and this would be another thing that puts pressure on it, and it could lead to a collapse of the economy and therefore the society. Mm-hmm. Is this true? And
I think it's simply not true. Firstly, even if you simply accept the importance of keeping the welfare state, whether minimal or extensive, there's no evidence that immigration has led to the collapse of those states, simply because people who immigrate, on the whole, aren't interested in simply making all this trouble simply to go on welfare. Of course, some part of them might be willing to, but this isn't the norm. The other, of course, a very important point to note is that there's absolutely no reason why you must be obliged to put anyone who comes into the country onto the welfare rolls. Yeah. If I give you my own example, when I moved to the London School of Economics in 2007, I entered with a 5-year work permit and eventually converted that to resident status. On my work permit, it simply said, not eligible for public funds. There's absolutely no entitlement that I had to welfare. So why assume that people coming into a country must be automatically entitled to welfare? So I think the final point I would say is that one could also turn this point around and say, well, if that's the case, if maintaining a strong welfare state must come at the expense of, firstly, the freedom of others to move, and secondly, at the expense of the freedom of those who want to invite others into their country and into their homes, then maybe this is a problem with the welfare state.
Craig, do you think that we should, what should we do first? Reform or dismantle the welfare state and temporarily stop migration, or should we do something else? What do you think about this argument that we cannot have both?
I'm for reducing the amount of illegitimate government force in any and every area we can simultaneously. So let's get rid of the restrictions, on the irrational and rights-violating restrictions on immigration. At the same time, let's get rid of the damn welfare state. The thing shouldn't exist to begin with. And I think your point is excellent, which is that most immigrants don't want to come in and live on the dole. They're the kind of people, by virtue of the fact that they're trying to get up and leave someplace to go to a better life, they're more often than not, they're the kind of people who want to build a good life by themselves. They're sort of self-sufficiently minded. And I think there's a really great example that they could set in a country that has a welfare state. So people who want to immigrate to a country with a welfare state, you say, look, you're welcome to come in, but you can't use any of the welfare apparatus. So you're going to be excluded from that, but you're also going to be exempt from the taxation that funds those, because it would be unfair to tax people to, tax them for this thing if they're not going to use it. So they're welcome to come in, they can't use the welfare state, and guess what that sets up? It sets up a really beautiful example for the rest of the people living in that country who are on welfare to get the hell off of it. You'd be able to watch immigrants come into a state, not have any access to welfare, and lo and behold, they just live perfectly lovely lives. They're productive, they start businesses, they send their kids to private schools, and so on. And this happened, I live in Southern California, and I see a lot of immigrants there who have come into the United States, and they're some of the lucky ones who were able to get in. Either they won the scratch card lottery for the H-1B visa or whatever, and so they get in, and what do? They build beautiful lives for themselves and their kids, almost invariably. So I think that the problem can be addressed. Both of these problems can be addressed at the same time. Let's chip away at the rights-violating anti-immigration laws, and let's chip away at the welfare state, and let the immigrants show the way on this. Let them come in blissfully off the dole, and they'll show us how it's done. So.
Great. I was looking, the questions are starting to arrive, which is good. But before we go to the Q&A, I have another question that maybe would be a great way to wrap up this formal part. There's a lot of people in the audience, I'm assuming, that in a few years will be working in public policy, and that maybe they're now activists who are already making tangible impact on public policy. And if we were to put everything we talked about today here into a public policy agenda, I would like to hear your, not agendas, like not policy papers, but maybe 3 to 7 key points that you think are very important to bear in mind for anyone working in public policy who would like to develop a solution that can be actionable, that can be sold to others. So if you have any suggestions of that kind, that would be great to share with the audience.
I'll be happy to go first. Policy is not my area. Ethics is more so than anything. So, I'll focus on that, though. I think that the one of the things that really needs to be stressed in policy debates is that we shouldn't have laws that are immoral, right? It is immoral to stop people from traveling and living where they want to live. It's just they have a literal moral right, and this moral right is grounded in the fact that human beings live by means of their mind, by means of reason. That's how we figure out what's true. That's how we figure out how we can use the resources in nature to create the values that we need to live. And that fact is what gives rise, ultimately, to the principle of individual rights. I'm going to be speaking on this tomorrow, so I'll sort of lay this out, how this all works. But the reason I'm bringing up this point now is because it's not just an opinion that people have a moral right to travel and live where they want to live. It's a demonstrable fact. And so when people are talking about public policy, they ought to know the argument for that fact, which again I'll be bringing in tomorrow. They ought to know that argument so that they can speak really, really cogently on this point and make the point that we have these laws that are literally immoral. Should we get rid of those kinds of laws? It just follows logically that we should. So let's put an end to those things And so so much goes on in public policy that's just pragmatic. It's just, oh, we'll move this piece here to appease that group, and we'll move this piece here to appease that group or whatever. And it never gets down to the brass tacks that underlies all of this, and that is what is right for a society to have, morally speaking. What kinds of laws should we have, and what kinds should we not have from a moral perspective? And the fact is, again, that open immigration and free travel across borders, for the most part, as long as people enter at a designated checkpoint, they have a right to do that.
Professor?
So your question was what advice I would give to someone wanting to go into public policy. Now, there are so many areas of public policy that people might be interested in, and I don't know them all well, although I know the immigration case particularly well. So what I would suggest is that since there are already very many people working in this field, in order to distinguish yourself from what is generally being done, I would consider thinking about public policy in a slightly different way to the way that most practitioners do, which is to simply take as given the parameters of the debate, to say there is this particular problem, and now we're looking for a solution to this particular problem. Okay? I'm not saying that this is a bad or mistaken way of going about things, but I think very often what's really important to understand is the genesis of the problem and ask oneself, why is this in fact regarded as a problem? So for example, if you take the case of immigration, as I mentioned before, the standard assumption is that there is this entity called the state, made up of another entity that is fixed, which is called the people, and there is a problem, which is called immigration. And there's been relatively little conceptual analysis to try to understand simply the terms that are involved in constructing this public policy question and indeed the public policy problem. So I think a very, very good way to start is simply by asking oneself, why is this to be understood as a problem, and what is the nature of the different elements that make up this thing that's turned it into a problem? And then use that as the basis really for moving forward into the kind of policy analysis that you might be interested in.
Very good. And with that, we can move on to the questions from the audience, which are constantly flowing in. We have the most recent one is if the proportion of foreigners on social welfare is higher than the proportion than the share of the local citizens on social welfare, would this be considered as a failure of immigration policy?
I think here the first thing I would say actually is you've got to figure out what you mean by a foreigner, okay? Because let's say you take the case in Britain, which I know particularly well. I was there for 12 years, but I was never a citizen. Okay? For the first 5 years, I was not entitled to any kind of welfare payments, even though I paid quite a lot of tax, as Britain is a high-taxing country. After that, I became a resident, but I was entitled to welfare should I have fallen on hard times. But was I then a foreigner, or was I something else? So there aren't just these two simple categories, citizens and foreigners. There are all kinds of people in between. There are people who are permanent residents who are working. There are people who are transients who move and come and do a job and leave. So when one thinks about welfare and welfare being paid to foreigners, who is it being paid to? And then the other question to ask yourself is, what do you mean by welfare here? Because there are so many forms that government provision now takes that could legitimately be described as welfare. For example, if you use the roads, this is publicly provided through taxes. If you send your kids to school, this is also publicly provided for most liberal democratic countries. If you use so many services, if you're a farmer, you are getting subsidized through the European Union or by the British government itself. All of these things are different forms of welfare. So I would say it's actually very hard to tell whether or not you're paying more to so-called foreigners than to your native citizens, because it's hard to know what you're going to count as welfare, and it's hard to know who you count as a citizen or a resident or a national or a foreigner.
Fred, do you have?
I think that's all true, but I do think that if there's a higher percentage of immigrants on welfare, that it is a failure of the immigration policy, because the immigration policy should be firm that they're not permitted to take any welfare, and that's better for the immigrants as well as for the pre-existing citizens of the country. Welfare is not a good thing. People shouldn't be on it. They should. Now, private charity is another matter. Obviously, there are times that people are, down and out, and they're having trouble in life, and private charity will and has taken care of that historically. That is not the government does not need to be involved in that, and it shouldn't be involved. So I think it's a failure of it would be a failure of the immigration policy, but more fundamentally, it would be a failure of the proper purpose of government, which is to protect rights instead of violate them. So.
Okay. I have a question here about the U.S., but I think this can be applied to any country, and it's based on the claim that if immigrants to a certain country tend to vote left of the political spectrum, and the left is opposed to the constitutional principles, so this question says basically, does this meet the definition of the demonstrable threat to our rights? So if the migrants or immigrants, actually legal immigrants, tend to vote towards parties that erode, by this opinion, the constitutional order of a country.
No, I don't think that's. I think what that demonstrates is that the citizenry in the country into which people are coming and voting for bad policies, that the citizens are failing to point out culturally, and to use the kind of moral language that I'm advocating here, that the right way to live is peacefully and in a way that we all live in harmony, enjoying the fruits of each other's various cultures and various specialization. And there's no place in there for people who want to initiate force or to have the government initiate force. Now, you can't police ideas. So you can't say to somebody, if you're going to vote Democrat, you can't move to this country. The job of the government is not to stop people from coming across borders based on who they're going to vote for. That is our job, not to stop them from coming across the border. I mean, to convince them who they properly should vote for. But the problem, in my view, in the liberty movement, the reason, I mean, the liberty movement is doing fairly well in certain regards, but it could be doing a whole lot better. And it would be doing a whole lot better at convincing people, both people in our countries already and people who want to immigrate to our countries, that the best kind of policies to advocate are rights-protecting policies. But to do that, we have to start using that language. And so, again, I know I'm sort of keep hitting this one point, but I think it's so important. There's a reason that the left has so much moral fervor behind it. And it's because they have a moral code that supports statism. They have this moral code that everybody's supposed to sacrifice, right? It's the moral code of altruism. And because everybody embraces that moral code, or so many people embrace that moral code, it's very easy to wind up, if that's your moral base, it's very easy to wind up advocating socialism. We need to hit that moral code.
Would you like to add anything to this?
I think only that I don't see that there's a lot of evidence that people coming into a country as immigrants are more likely to be on the left. It really does depend on where they're coming from and when they're coming. For example, after the end of the Vietnam War, there was a large influx of immigrants from Vietnam fleeing the new communist regime. The British Labour government was very reluctant to allow them in as refugees because they thought they would vote for the right-wing parties, for the Conservatives, because they were anti-communist. And there may have been some truth to that. There were people from the Baltic states who left to move to Australia because it was then under the Soviet Union, and they tended to be more right-wing under most people's impression. So it's really going to depend on where they come from. I don't think we can assume that all immigrants are left-wing and are always left-wing. Not that I think it would matter, but I just don't think it's the case.
All right, and we have time for maybe one more question because it's 5 minutes until we have to wrap up. So I've just received a question also about the more radical parties who are using now the fear of migration to incite hatred. Do you think that freedom movement how should people who support libertarian values, so to speak, whether it is liberal democracy or open society, respond to this situation where we have this, where basically certain political elements are nudging people into not only being concerned about migration, but now maybe inciting hatred on racial basis, on national ethnic basis, or any other basis. Do you think that there is a proper answer to this?
Well, I think inciting hatred is, people are free to hate whatever they should be free to hate or love whatever they want to love. Those are emotions. So inciting emotions is not a danger. The danger is inciting violence. And when that happens, it should be treated as an initiation of force. The incitement to violence is, if it's genuine incitement to violence, is a form of indirect force, and it should be outlawed. But people should be free to believe or to advocate, any kinds of ideas that they want. And again, if the culture and the individualists in that culture are willing to put moral pressure on people who have bad ideas like that, and point out that it's just wrong to have those ideas, that human life requires that we have ideas that are about living together peacefully, then I think we can make some headway.
Very good. I think it is a difficult problem because when there is significant migration, as there has been, for example, to Britain over the last 20 years or so, it becomes the interest of some political actors to take advantage of this by drawing attention to this as a cause of whatever problems that a society might face. It's just so tempting for politicians to pick up on any source of discontent and amplify it. And this is what gives rise to all kinds of populist sentiments. I think it's really in many ways a product of political entrepreneurship. I think, unfortunately, there isn't really a solution to this within the structure of the state, because this is the nature of the state. This is how states operate. People hold on to power by convincing the right sections of the community to give them the support they want. And they can only do that by essentially saying the things that they think will turn the minds of those people to support them. So I don't think there's a structural kind of solution to this. As classical liberals, I think the only thing that we can really do is to continue to make the arguments, to continue to try to emphasize the kinds of principles that we believe in. And I think especially not so much to try to persuade those who are trying to cause fear and anxiety among people, but actually to try to persuade those who are, if you like, the more moderate people who are likely to be swayed by this to think, okay, there is this danger. What we've got to do is change our policy to pander to this concern, rather than think more clearly about what actually lies behind this. I think that's where we have a role to play.
Thank you, and thank you very much both for your answers to all these questions, and thank you to the audience. You've been a great audience.
Okay.
Yep.
That's good.